Welcome to our second discussion of moral pluralism. Now, as we've seen in our first lecture, moral pluralism is a different form of ethics compared to what we've seen thus far in the semester. Other forms of ethics that we studied so far are what we call morally monistic. That is, that they have one particular feature of morality that they base their ethical theory on. So again, for example, with utilitarianism, they base it on the principle of utility. Kant bases his off of principle of autonomy, for example, or the categorical imperative. We talked about the theory of the right. Likewise, we see that same thing in divine command theory, where the theory is based completely upon God's commands, or God being the sole source of morality. Moral relativism, we saw that it's based on cultural norms. So it's kind of maybe more categorical than specific, but still based on one thing. Moral pluralism, again, differentiates itself from those other theories by saying that real life is simply more complex than one idea. And therefore, our ethics should be more flexible as well in order to really truly account for morality and moral dilemmas. Our theory in a nutshell thus far was that an action is right if and only if one has a prima facie duty to do the action that is more stringent than any other conflicting prima facie duty that may be present. Remember that the idea of stringency, that is, what is the most pressing or most important issue at hand, was how we ultimately made our decision. Now, we've yet to really get to the idea of how we deal with conflict, but we're going to get there here in just a moment. Our theory of the good, which we'll be discussing in this lecture, involves the four basic intrinsic goods: virtue, pleasure, the state consisting of pleasure in proportion to virtue, and knowledge. So ultimately, how do we deal with moral conflict and moral pluralism? Remember, we avoided the consistency problem because we were able to say, well, given certain situations, certain actions become more apparent to us. Again, we get to our all things considered duty, which is our duty proper. But whenever we have the problem of adjudication, that is, how do we choose between these, we've yet to get there. For that purpose, we have to look at a decision-making procedure. And according to Ross, moral judgment is that decision-making procedure. Now, unlike what we saw with, say, for example, Kant's universal law formulation of the categorical imperative, moral judgment is not going to be methodical necessarily, but it is going to involve certain things that we do need to take into consideration. First, we need to make sure that we are correctly identifying morally relevant features involved in the situation. Not only after we identify, we have to examine them, we then have to look at the applicable prima facie duties. And then we use our judgment to determine our all things considered duty. This may seem really kind of ambiguous and maybe even nebulous, but ultimately, according to this theory, that's actually a good thing. If moral situations are complex, then our decision-making procedure should also be complex. It should also be fluid. It should be flexible. Rigid decision-making procedures may ultimately end up leading us to a position where we're not able to make an appropriate decision because the decision-making procedure doesn't account truly for the situation. So again, we're going to argue to some extent that the lack of maybe consistency and determinacy may actually be valuable. This is an unusual part of this theory. When we talk about our theory of the good, likewise, we're rejecting monistic accounts of value. And we're instead arguing that there are four basic goods: virtue, pleasure, the state consisting of pleasure in proportion to virtue, and knowledge. Ross states, "It seems clear that we regard all such virtuous actions and dispositions as having value in themselves apart from any consequence. And if one is inclined to doubt this and to think that, say, pleasure alone is intrinsically good, it seems to me enough to ask the question whether, of two states of the universe holding equal amounts of pleasure, we should really think no better of one in which the actions and dispositions of all persons in it were thoroughly virtuous than one in which they were highly vicious. To this there can be but one answer." This quote from Ross illustrates how Ross justifies this. We've seen in some of our other theories that, for example, in natural law theory, there's an examination of rational reflection and so forth on human nature and things would seem to perfect human nature. Well, Ross isn't even giving us anything that complex. Ross is saying, hey, if I imagine a world where these things exist versus a world where these things don't exist, what world do I want to live in? Do I want to live in a world where virtue is praised and something we consider to be good? Or do I want to live in a world where viciousness or vice is considered praiseworthy? Ross is saying, in essence, that these things become self-evident whenever we consider the two alternatives. Now, with regards to the completeness of the list, Ross tells us that there are two things that we need to make certain to realize. First, that we are not able to think of some other item as intrinsically good, and not merely either a species of one or other of the four intrinsic goods on this list, or reducible to some combination of them. That is, Ross isn't able to consider other things and not say, well, those things may be derived from this. They seem to derive from it, according to him. So Simmons brings up the idea of aesthetic enjoyment, for example, of being a combination of pleasure and insight into the object of enjoyment, or that is, of knowledge of that thing. So I may be able to say that, therefore, it's derivable from these four basic goods. The second issue, according to Timmins, lies in his defense of the list. Now, what he ends up telling us here is that these basic elements of the mind and soul can be derived or can be discussed in terms of faculties of cognition, feeling, and conation, that is, of willing. Ideally, we exist in these states. That is, we find ways to work with this, to end up enhancing our life. So he believes that he's also giving us, in essence, a psychological statement of good psychological or moral health. Now, when we discuss moral value, that is, what makes an agent praiseworthy or blameworthy, agents can be praised or blamed depending on their virtuous disposition, which he believes comes from our motivations for action. Now, unlike Kant, who gave us one motive, he ends up giving us several. First, he tells us that when we act from the motive of duty, that we're acting in such a way that we can be praised. Secondly, when we're acting from the desire to produce good, that's also praiseworthy. And lastly, when we're acting from the desire to produce pleasure for others or reduce or prevent pain for others, that these are also good. So this brings us back to understanding our theory. We may be able to, split Ross's duties into two different camps. We may be able to say that some of his prima facie duties are more value-based and to some extent more consequential. Special obligations, however, are things that concern the past or concern ideas associated with particular human relationships. Because of this, we can say that part of his theory of the right is dependent upon his theory of the good. That is, whenever he states that these four value states or values are important, that he's going to base, to some extent, his theory of the right on this. Now, there are several objections that can be made towards moral pluralism. And perhaps the first one is simply asking, is this an unconnected heap of moral requirements? Well, this is a potential significant challenge. But again, the nature of this theory ends up answering this. Again, we're not going to argue that there's any type of supreme principle that may underlie all these things. But we may be able to argue that there are loose interpretations here with regards to the prima facie duties of respect. And therefore, they may be interconnected in some way. Now, Ross doesn't go forward and tell us that respect is a supreme virtue or anything like that, or a supreme prima facie duty. But he does argue that there may be some type of connections. Second, we may be able to ask about the question about over-demandingness. Are we required to always bring about the good, given that almost any action has prima facie right-making and prima facie wrong-making features? This is important. What Ross is able to do here is he's able to tell us that situations may give us moral considerations for acting, but may not necessarily require us to act in certain ways. Again, the use of judgment is going to be absolutely key here. But he believes that reality doesn't necessarily dictate our actions. The question of indeterminacy is also important. The objection follows. Pluralism does not give us determinate moral verdicts about actual duty. The way in which Ross and pluralists answer this is by saying at the level of judgment, there is no indeterminacy. That is, we're making a determinate judgment, yes or no, with regards to conflict. But they also do an unusual thing here by saying that this lack of necessary determinacy at various places is actually a benefit, because the theory is therefore more able to relate to reality. And this ultimately is seen as being good. It's good to have a morality which is flexible. And last, we get back to, again, the questions of arbitrariness. Judgment is not about just applying rules. People vary in their moral sensibilities, thus in judgment too. So ultimately, this objection asks, how do we make sense of judgment? How can I criticize, for example, somebody else's moral judgment in a certain situation? To this, the pluralist will look at other considerations, other places where we don't consider judgment to be arbitrary. So, for example, if we look at science. In science, we don't necessarily go forward and make arguments that says that things are arbitrary whenever we use judgment. So, for example, if I'm going to judge a particular amount of evidence or data to be important or to be not important, it may not be arbitrary, but instead I may have certain rules that are set up there, things such as that. Additionally, they argue that judgment is actually required in all moral theories. And it's a unique characteristic and perhaps a virtue of this theory that it embraces the role of moral judgment so closely. Last, it's also remarkably important that we note that moral ties may exist. We may end up in situations where we don't have a clear-cut yes or no with regards to how we should act. We may have competing reasons and competing duties that are both applicable. So in the end, where do we get when we talk about Rossian pluralism? Well, we actually get quite far. The theory seems to fit well with how we think about morality. And allowing for partiality is important. That is, it allows for us to consider things like special obligations. So, for example, my obligation to you versus an obligation to a stranger. That seems to be intuitively appealing. We like the idea that people who are important to us deserve a certain different, or maybe a different type of moral consideration. We can get moral or consistent judgments because we can override rules. Now, again, when we override a rule, it doesn't mean that we avoid or cancel out a particular duty. It may mean that we actually enhance that, and it may end up actually even giving us more duties. The theory also seems to fit well with our considered moral beliefs, which satisfies our consideration of eternal support, though maybe not in very strong ways. We don't get determinacy, but according to this theory, that's a virtue, not a vice.